So Steve is a member of a research ethics committee. His background is that he was a clinical research associate many, many years ago, and then an auditor of clinical trials. And then about 25 years ago, had a bit of a career change and is now a vicar in the Church of England. But he is on an ethics committee as a lay member, but obviously has this background in clinical research as well. So he's been on 2 ethics committees, 2 different ones, over a total of about 10 years, we decided, wasn't it, Steve? So he's got a lot of experience of working on an ethics committee, and I'm just going to hand over to him. He's got some slides to share about his experience of ethics committees, what they look at, and his experience with CWOW and combined review. So if you do have any questions or particular things you'd like to maybe bring up with him, do be thinking about that, because we'll have time for questions, or if you want to put them in the chat as we're going along, that would be great as well. As the eagle-eyed amongst you did also work out that he is my husband, so obviously it means I have easy access, but it is great to have you presenting today, so thank you very much, and I will stop my share and let you share your screen now. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Jo. Well, hello everybody. It's really nice to be here, and I hope this is a useful session. Jo's been badgering me to do this for her for a while. So what I want to do is just go through a little bit about what we do as a medical research ethics committee. I hope it's helpful to you to hear from the other side, if you like, about how we process trials and how we what we'll look at, what are particular issues that we focus in on. I'm a member of the Greater Manchester Central Research Ethics Committee and have been for about the last 5 years. Prior to that, I was on an ethics committee for Cheshire, and then of course they've switched things around a number of times in my years on it. But I'm with the Greater Manchester Ethics Committee, which is one of the core ethics committees that's been used for the pilot of the CWOW process. So we've been doing some fairly innovative stuff, but we're recognised for both CTIMPs in healthy volunteers and patient studies. And we've got various flags as a committee. We're flagged for phase 1 studies in healthy volunteers and phase 1 studies in patients, for studies involving research in children, and for research tissue banks. So those are our flags, and that's our specialties. And perhaps the easiest thing is for me just to take you through what we do. Forgive me if this is familiar ground for you. I didn't know quite where to pitch it, so some of it I'm sure will be very familiar, but I just thought I'd take you through the process that we go through in our sort of regular meetings, which are monthly. So we have a system called HARP, which is the online system where IRAS forms are submitted along with every other piece of documentation which you're putting through with your study. And sometimes that can number 40 or 50 documents that are for each study. So there's an awful lot of information that we have. If it's a CWOW study, we don't always get an IRAS form, as you probably know. We just get the protocol and a summary review along with all the other study material. But they're sent out to us maybe 2 to 3 weeks before the study. There are 2 types of meetings. There's our full meeting, which since lockdown has taken place on Zoom, obviously, but it's going to continue on Zoom. Investigators in particular have found it far easier to attend meetings on Zoom rather than in person, and it was just felt it was a lot more helpful to the whole process to continue it on Zoom. So that's the monthly full meeting where we review between 4 and 6 studies each month. Any more than that we just can't manage. I mean, that's already 3 to 4 hours of meeting, which is a bit of a killer, but between 4 and 6 studies per month. Then there's obviously in between the main studies, there's subcommittees and proportional review processes where protocol amendments come through and much simpler studies are covered by proportional review, of which there's usually the chair and or vice chair and one or two other members of the committee. So that's the kind of structure that's behind the committees. I've mentioned flags and what we're flagged for. I'm sure you know, but just to sort of lay it out, there's about 10 to 12 people on a research ethics committee, and it is made up of experts, scientists and doctors, but lay people. And Joe wasn't quite right. I'm a lay plus member, because there is a distinction. Lay people have got absolutely no experience in clinical trials, but lay plus members have some recognized experience, and although they're not technical people in their role anymore. So I'm flagged as a lay plus person because of my background in clinical research. When studies come through, they're assigned to a primary and a secondary reviewer. And it's the role of the primary reviewer to read absolutely everything on the study and to present it to the committee at the meeting. Secondary reviewers do the same thing, and they're sort of backup. Everybody reads the IRS forms and is familiar with the study. They then make their comments using a form on HARP that the meeting then works its way through, and they look at various different areas within that study. But that's the process of how we go about our meetings. CWOW, as Joe mentioned, we have been on the pilot scheme for CWOW. With these studies, the MHRA send through their own review to us as an ethics committee in advance, so that we can see what they've flagged up as issues. They tend to focus much more on the technical questions and on the legal side of things. And so we've got their input. And obviously, it's a slightly different area of focus by them, although there is often an overlap with the ethical side of things as well. So when it comes to the actual meeting, we have an MHRA rep at the meeting, along with the ethics committee, and the chair will usually invite the rep to ask their questions of the investigators when they arrive. So we work in tandem, and it's actually worked extremely well in the pilot scheme. So that's a little bit about combined review. What issues do we focus on? What issues come up the most often? It might not surprise you, but as an ethics committee, our main focus is on the safety and informed consent of the patients. So the consent form is one of the main areas where we pick up a lot of issues. From the ethics committee point of view, we want the consent form to be something that does inform the patient, that is lay friendly, that is laid out in such a way that isn't 60 pages of black on white text that is so dense and difficult to get through that you just want to lose the will to live to read. So these are often things which we flag up. So not being lay friendly is one of the most common things that we see in the consent forms and the patient information sheets. And quite often, in fact, I would say between 50 and 75% of the time, what we get is people just copying and pasting bits of the protocol into the patient information sheet, which is just far too technical. And I've got a scientific degree and a scientific background, and I'm sitting there reading this stuff and thinking, this doesn't make sense to me. And so that comes up very, very regularly. If they've not done that, they've still often made it too long, too complicated. Often there's no flow diagrams of what patients go through on the study. There's no tables to say what tests they're going to have. It's just all dense text. and actually quite hard to follow. So I'd say that's one of the most frequent things that we comment on as an ethics committee when we see that sort of thing. Patients need to be informed about the study. They need it to be digestible, and diagrams are great. Different colors help as well. We've seen some absolutely brilliant consent forms, and we always comment how good they are when we see them, because we recognize that they've actually sort of thought about the patient. And sometimes, which we find quite helpful as well, they split the patient information sheet into 2 parts. So they'll do a very simple summary of the study for patients in 2 or 3 pages, and then they'll have an annex of the much more technical stuff and legal stuff that obviously needs to be included as a second document. And that's often praised by ethics committees as well. What we do sometimes pick up on is what I've called coercive language here, where it sounds as though the patient doesn't really have the choice not to be involved in this study. You'd be amazed at some of the language that is used that does actually try to push the patient to be involved in the study, rather than giving them the option, obviously, not to be. Recently, we've been seeing studies where there are issues with foreign language patients. What do you do about that when you've got a patient who English isn't their first language? And there's questions then about how that's handled. Who can be an independent witness for that patient is a big question. And we had a long debate at the last meeting about whether or not it needed to be a medical person or whether or not a family member could do that. And it wasn't very clear from the investigator's point of view how they would handle that. So that's something else that comes up as well. And as I said, we've seen some extremely good examples of patient information sheets as well. Other areas that we focus in on that come up fairly regularly are things like trial design. We had a study a couple of months ago that had what we felt was an over number of invasive tests. We recognize, depending on what the study is, that it will have invasive tests. That's research. But we were picking up things where we felt, particularly, I think this was to do with MRI tests and things like this, and they were being asked to come in monthly for MRIs, and we kind of checked this and said, is this necessary to the actual trial? And it wasn't. So we do pick that up from time to time. Sometimes we pick up a lack of clarity in dosing. This is particularly in phase 1 and phase 1/2 studies, where the investigators seem to want to leave themselves open to kind of decide during the study how they're going to do this. So they've started them off on the lowest dose and then said, well, we might then step it up to this, or it might step it up during the study, but they don't give clarity on how that process will be decided and what steps might take place in it. So we picked that up. And follow up after the trial is another area. Will patients, if there's no other medication available, will they be allowed to carry on with the trial medication? That's a question that comes up. From an ethical point of view, it is a question about patient safety and well-being. When we look at qualitative studies, more so than quantitative research, we sometimes question whether or not this is really new research. What will this show that hasn't already been looked into? As I say, it comes up perhaps a little bit more regularly in qualitative type studies rather than quantitative type studies. So, and because we do get quite a few PhD studies coming through as well, that's where we perhaps pick up that sort of question. Finally, some other things that come up. Reimbursements is a huge one that comes up all the time now in our deliberations. And it is a changing field. When I was in clinical trials, large reimbursements were only really for phase 1 studies in healthy volunteers. Now it's being offered to patients in phase 1 studies as well as phase 2 studies. And this develops a lot of discussion in the ethics committee. Is this an appropriate level of reimbursement? So that comes up regularly. We do from time to time question whether or not the investigators really just care about the patient themselves throughout the study. Perhaps especially during COVID, we saw investigators who just wanted to push this research through, and the patient's care wasn't. We were concerned that they weren't actually being thought of first. Now, another area that comes up, and this is quite an interesting field, is when, for example, DNA testing is done in a specific field. The results may well show other areas of concern, and we really question the investigators about how this will be handled, because obviously if a DNA sample throws up something more serious that's not to do with the trial, that needs to be handled carefully for the patient's benefit. So those are some of the other ad hoc issues. There are other things that come up, as you can imagine, but those are the most frequent ones. And just to finish with, last slide, we do give lots of praise where praise is due. I just want to say that because sometimes I think the ethics committee can just be seen as people who pick problems and things and moan about things and have issues with things, but we don't. We're regularly praising investigators and companies for good research, good consent forms, good trial design, and we really see some absolutely fantastic principal investigators as well as some not so fantastic ones. so we're generally a very friendly lot, and I hope that's been of some help. I'll hand back to Joe